let's start this nice conversation, this book launch. Where is the book? Is there? You can see there. You can go and take a look if you want. And my name is Ana Cristina Suzina, for those who were not there at midday when I was moderating another roundtable. And I'm very happy to be here in this book launch so we can talk about communications in Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, a critical history. We'll have here the author, Burce Celik, and we have Nelson Ribeiro. Yeah, I'm sorry, with us as well to talk about this work. Reading the summary of it, I could not actually go beyond. I stayed in one of the first sentences that you've written, and I think this is one exercise that we could do today. What if the history of modern communications development were not written from the vantage point of Anglo-European societies? How many times do we open our minds to think about it? Is there an only way of thinking about the development of media and communications? How much we are framed by theories, by ideas, and we actually cannot go beyond them to think about what communication and media represent to our societies. And reading this and getting in a certain way stuck in this question, I recalled another question or another reflection that we don't know. There are many. It is attributed to many people. We don't know exactly who said it first. That is, we can, in our society now, we can be afraid and imagine the end of the world, but we have difficulties imagining the end of capitalism. And I think this question that Burce asks in this book goes in the same way. Can we see alternatives to the way media and communication are developed? Do they need to be the way they are? Can we look maybe not to imaginations but to the past and get inspired by other forms of organizing media and communication? And I will leave the floor to Burce so she can tell a bit about how was this adventure and how she is framing the reflections to answer this question.
Perfect. So I'm glad that you all have some drinks, so you can bear with me and with my book. And Nelson promised me that he will say all negative things about the book, so that you won't buy and read it. So what should I say? So I'll just talk a bit about the motivations and my adventures. I'm not going to give a sort of summary of the book, but yes, that was sort of what if we just take another region as a sort of vantage point for our explorations of the history for media and communications. After listening to Dan, my talk would be or my book would be, incomparable in the sense that, his work is absolutely inspirational, and mine is, not there, not far, even close. But telecommunications is something that I'm also very much interested in. So, just in 10 minutes, I'll talk about the sort of journey that I had. So I started working on modernity and technology issue, working on these issues at my PhD. So I was very much interested in technology, philosophy of technology, in relation to modernity. But the way that we understand modernity in our textbooks, especially if you do your PhD in North, they're like particular textbooks, and modernity is always like rooted in European, Anglo-European context, and there is one modernity. All the others are either incomplete or aberration from the norm. So that was my first, sort of passion, as they say, passionate workers. So then I started thinking about, how about, where I come from. We have this particular attachment to, at the time, mobile phones were so significant. So I started to think about the relationship between Turkish population, Kurdish population with mobile phone. So it took me to think about, it led me to think about the sort of like historicity. So I think there is the sense of, which you can also see in Britain, the nostalgia for empire. We were an empire, once upon a time. And I think that's what was also very prominent in Turkish Kurdish society. And somehow technology was something that symbolized that they lost it, having it, processing it, mastering it one way or another was a sort of like substitute. So I was no historian. I know that we have historians here. So, but this led me to think about history. What is the history? What kind of relationship did we have with communication technologies or communication, in general? So I had a research grant in 2011 looking at, first I was interested in mobile phone, then in 2011, those days I was more interested in telephony because I thought that telephony is an ancestor of mobile phone. So I did, I had this research project along with my colleagues, and we tried to do a sort of longue durée, exploration of telephony from the late 19th century Ottoman Empire to 21st century Turkey. And I wanted to sort of connect it to Turkish modernization, Kurdish modernization, Armenian loss, or, we can talk about all these things. So the region. And at the time, I had many frustrations. One of them is that whenever you just look at historical works in English language, or even in Turkish language, you can't really find, you couldn't find anything that is written about Ottoman Empire, Turkey, or the Middle East in general. According to one survey, a literature survey, which was done in 2009, they looked at all the historical research on media and communication written in English language, which is prime language, which Anna wrote about actually a couple of years ago. Middle East did not appear at all. So it was so that region is ahistorical. It has no space, no place in global communication history, in the literature. So when you look at the sort of Ottoman Empire literature or Turkish studies, Kurdish studies literature, again you see that communication media are over. These issues are overlooked. So it's just if you are curious about these things, you can't find anything. Yeah, or it was not possible to find anything at the time. There was possibility to find episodic histories which do not tell much about the sort of what has been lost, what was there, and what changed in longer process of history. So that frustration was the main motivation for me to get into research. So after 2013, I expanded the research from telephony to telecommunications, and then sort of more broader holistic approach, because I think that this balkanization of media studies is not very good. We have to have a sort of holistic understanding of communication. So in the years that led to coup d'etat in Turkey, which made me directly or indirectly an academic exile in London. That authoritarian turn brought a new turn for my work. So I was, as everyone else, I was just like looking at all the discussions about how Turkey has become a sort of like almost fascistic state. You can have different conceptualizations, populism, authoritarianism, competitive authority. There are many. But what struck me was that like we often did not really talk about the sort of like the changes that Turkey had, from the sort of late Ottoman Empire to today. And if there is a repression, what was there before? And what was the exact role of capitalism? So those questions brought a sort of like different light to my research. And then I thought, like, in many senses, our discipline is incapable of defining things, incapable of explaining things like authoritarianism, press freedom, etc., because it doesn't have any root in other histories. They only know mostly what England has done. And in the context, as many of you have spoken today, in the sort of like white England. So, because, I thought that like many of our conceptions, and I still believe that, that's why I just wanted to also organize this workshop conference along with my colleagues. History informs our theoretical positions. History informs how we think about media and communications. I mean, we often talk about, or the discipline talks about public sphere as a sort of like main normative concept. But the public sphere is about English society, bourgeois English society. How about other public forms? How about other public spaces in other places? So these questions led me to identify mainly three normative assumptions that we have in mainstream media and communication studies. One is that modernity is an endogenous production of Europe and Anglo-European societies. So European imperialism, colonialism, or a simple sort of like geopolitical connections do not really matter. So that's what many people call methodological internalism. The second one is many of the, even those very critical voices in political economy conceived communication as a product of capitalist modernity. So modernity is always capitalistic. And then the sort of like very general liberal, I would say, but some of you would disagree, paradigm is like, oh, so if there are markets, then they're necessarily naturally capitalistic. So if there is like a communication market, then modern communication is necessarily capitalistic. This naturalizes and eternalizes capitalism and capitalist mode of communication. From more Marxist point of view, I also cite Graham in that respect. So they provide a much more nuanced understanding of capitalist communication. So there is sort of like, there's a recognition of capitalist mode of communication is a particular historical form. So it's not natural, it's not eternal. But again, from that perspective too, we do not really see the decoupling of modernity and capitalism in modern communication sphere. So then, how then we just like talk about non-capitalist journalism? How do we talk about non-capitalistic telegraphy communication? And how can we really talk about the sort of transformation of these things into something else when communications were commodified? So that was the second one, and I wanted to decouple these things by also looking at geopolitical and social. The third one, you know, we all know that like there was a sort of separation of the East from the West. So as if these two are two different and fundamentally different things, and with the often assumption that Western communication and modernity is superior for others. So no offense, but the paradigms of media for development, media for freedom, media for modernization, all these paradigms also work for it. But I wanted to show that now there were other things that were happening in these societies. I looked at like different public communications in Ottoman Empire and in its own non-capitalistic modernity. I looked at, I tried to look at Kurdish voice in communicative experiences. I tried to look at women. I tried to look at unionized, you know, workers' struggle, student struggle, because I think that they form their own communicative practices. It's not only about them. The book is not only about the silenced ones, but it's also about like complicating the noisy ones, like the state and the geopolitical differences. So that's what I tried to do in the book. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Burce. Nelson, what did you get?
Okay, so
Horrible book.
no. So first of all, thank you so much for this invitation, which I'm sure is going to make this book launch quite original, because I think that the non-written norm is that you invite someone who really knows about the topic of the book to present the book. So here you decided to invite someone who is not an expert. So what I can actually share with you is what I actually got from the book, being someone who is not an expert in Turkish studies. So I think that my only contribution here is to show how the book is really interesting, enlightening, and actually problematizes how we think about networks and communications, even if we are not very much into the context of the book itself. So the first thing I would like to say, for those of you who have not had the chance to see the book yet, is that it presents a history of the interplay and entanglements between communication networks and political and economic actors in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey. So even though technology is central, it plays a central role in the book, the book does not take a technological-centric approach to communication networks, but rather places these within the history of social relations and social struggles. And as Burce just mentioned, the book does something quite fascinating, which is it gives visibility to those who had been mostly made invisible or silent in historical accounts. I'm thinking about women, I'm thinking about Kurds, I'm thinking even about the youth movements more recently that I'm sure Erdogan would like to make very invisible and silent, and that you do speak and mention them very much in the volume. Something that is also quite impressive about this work is the fact that it spans from the mid-1800s until the early 2010s. It follows a longue durée approach, focusing on continuities and processes of change, giving particular attention to contingencies, contradictions, and interactions between different actors that shape communication networks. Throughout the different chapters, it is clear that understanding the history of telecommunications, and this is quite interesting to say after the talk we were just listening to, the book also makes it quite obvious to the reader that to understand the history of telecommunications, this requires obviously also understanding at least something about geopolitics. Or geopolitics. And in the book, Burce also discusses how international political actors have used communication technologies to take control and sustain power. Many examples that you will find in the book deal with the Cold War, but it also demonstrates how in very different settings, in different historical periods, how communication technologies and practices were always perceived by political actors as a locus of power. It presents many examples of this, starting from the postal service under Sultan Mahmud II in the mid-1800s to Erdogan's counter-terrorist laws aimed at limiting the political activities of those who oppose his government and policies. So it's a wide range of examples that I think allows her to make a very not only interesting but convincing argument about how these power structures relate and how they make use of communication networks. On page 4, Burce writes that typically West-centered narratives treat communications as a byproduct of capitalist modernity, something that you just mentioned now. And the book, in my opinion, gives a valuable contribution to contest these narratives by demonstrating how the state and the political elites in the Ottoman Empire were fully engaged in the modernization of its communication technologies long before the transition to capitalism. And this is something that I really found striking and really interesting about the book. One of its major contributions to scholarship comes from the fact that it takes, as you also mentioned, the reader very much away from Western-centric capitalist perspective on the history of communication. And while these histories tend to place the origins and agency of communications in the West, the book takes a post-colonial and non-Western approach, allowing us to learn about new protagonists and new epistemologies. As was also mentioned, while in the West, and here I'm not sure I should actually say in the West, maybe I would prefer to say maybe in the Anglo-American context, modernity is presented as being associated with concepts such as the individual, freedom of expression, the public sphere that you just mentioned. The book presents an alternative history of the networks of non-capitalist modernity and how these are entangled with the political society and forms of political participation that prioritize the collective and not the individual. As she demonstrates, and I quote, in the Ottoman Empire, the experience and imaginations of modern communications were rooted in non-capitalistic modernity and justice. The book is organized in a chronological order. So, I mean, this on one hand is not surprising. On the other hand, for someone who is not acquainted with the history of the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, it's really helpful to get a sense of the timeline. So these, the 5 chapters, they focus on different technologies and their entanglements with the political and political struggles. Chapter 1 looks into the usage of postal, roads, and telegraphy and discusses the role of books and petitions in the formation of a political society in the late Ottoman Empire, marked by the concept of equal justice for all, later transitioned to Islamic justice. Chapter 2 is dedicated to the history of communications during the Turkish War of Independence and to the histories of the post, telegraphy, and telephony in the Republican era. It discusses the role played by different communication technologies also in the process of nation building, which is one of the key concepts also addressed in the book. It argues, or the author argues, that the militarization of communications has been prevalent and a central phenomenon to geopolitical relations from the mid-19th century Crimea War to the 21st century conflicts in the region. Even though this idea is discussed throughout the book in many different chapters, it is given particular attention on chapter 3, in which she describes what Burce also labels as the Americanization of Turkey. The two last chapters are dedicated to neoliberal transformation of Turkey in the late 20th century and to the alterations of the country's communication ecosystem after the rise to power of the Justice and Development Party in the early 21st century. The last chapter is clearly a must-read for all those interested in understanding contemporary Turkey and the intertwined relationships between populism, censorship, surveillance, so many of the topics that we have been having, many of the discussions that we have been having today. So overall, I believe the book makes a significant contribution to scholarship. For some like me, who is, well, quite ignorant on the history of Turkey, it provides a background information on society, culture, and politics, which makes it actually a nice and informative read. In a broader sense, I believe that its main contribution is actually to make us think about how much we don't know about the history of communications from outside the Western world, or perhaps from outside the Anglo-American world. It also makes us think how our thinking is influenced by capitalist narratives while disregarding others that may offer a richer comprehension of the history of telecommunications. And for all this, I think it is actually a fascinating book, and I do recommend that you get the chance to read it. And thank you.
So we have around 20 minutes. If you have questions to the author or to the reader, or if there is another reader in the room and wants to make a comment and add some kind of reflections and reactions to the reading, you are welcome as well. Please.
Yes, I have a question, Burce. I'm very interested on the archival basis of your book and the archival landscape in Turkey in general, because I'm completely ignorant about what you find in the archives, if there are any, and how they are organized, and what kind of sources you use to write your book.
So I used Ottoman archives. So it's very interesting because many of the discussions about global South histories starts with, oh, we don't have enough archives. And I guess like now I'm looking at Mesopotamia, I may find that like there is not enough archives. But Ottoman Empire has always kept a good record of what they have done. But it's very interesting kind of archival. So for instance, in British archives, you would find a very sort of like precise description of events, people, time, and etc. But the way that Ottomans recorded events were different. So, I mean, just talking about, let's say, after Crimean War, some British entrepreneurs approached Ottoman Empire to start the both railway and telegraph networks. So in British archives, you would see, all the names and the company name and everything. In Ottoman archives, you would see they often called infidels, but they say like someone, a gentleman origin from Britain, or they would mostly call English. So these are the differences. So then, like, if you find anything like this in Ottoman archives, you should check it with the British archive. So what I did is, in the first bit of my research, I lived in Turkey at the time, so I looked at Ottoman Empire, Ottoman archives and Turkish archives.
What are they? Which cities?
So there is a lot in Ankara, the capital city. There is also there's some archives in Istanbul too. There's There are many. I mean, I can give you all the details as well. And then after I moved to London, I looked at British Library Archives, National Archives, Metropolitan Archives, BT Archives. So I looked at all those archives, and I used a lot digitized version of US archives because Turkey has become so central for I would say US imperialism after Second World War. So because of many reasons. So they have a good chunk of archival material there. So I looked at all these things. But my main problem was also the language because in 1928, Turkish administration did a change in the alphabet from Arabic script into Latin script. So I had to learn the Arabic script. Yeah.
Thank you, Burce. I had a question about, it was very, I look forward to read the full book, I read some about. I had a question about, do you think the Turkish leadership has ever, so let's say in brief, Republicans and then militaries when they were ruling, do they have ever challenged this Western view, like communication has the link between communication and modernization? Have they ever tried to develop a non-Western approach or theory, or they have adopted, for example, last year the opposition party, the first thing to counteract was just let's go on YouTube giving an interview with this very popular in YouTube. So have they ever tried to challenge this model, or they have been trying?
So I mean, if you're talking about the administration, the state, of course, this is the other thing. Like the way that we, in sort of like in West-centric sociology and history, we often, Weber and all those, like even Marx talk about Eastern societies as yet, as like despotic societies. So there's one despot, there's one state, it is homogeneous, and then they do everything. It's never like that, and I'm trying. I hope that I do it. Like in my chapters, like it was much more complicated. So there has always been competition, struggle within the state or the classes that organize themselves as state. So they were not interested in theory or whatever, but during the Ottoman Empire, for a very long time, they tried to keep the empire intact. So by selectively, not copying, but by selectively integrating some of the communicative things into the empire to create sort of like reproduction of the empire, but also they tried to push away the European presence, especially British, French, Austrian presence. So this was mostly in political economic terms. So they wouldn't allow, foreign investment, as just like actually Dan talked about. So they wouldn't really allow non-Ottoman ownership of telegraph lines overland. So they were very, very careful about that. This also continued in the early Republican time. And I think my argument is that capitalism was not commodified during this period. It changes when US becomes the world hegemon, and especially after Second World War, because Turkey became sort of like, they make the decision to align with the US in Cold War period, because there's also all these threats coming from Stalin, and then everything changes. So the country's communicative realm became increasingly commodified and militarized. Has it not been challenged? It has always been challenged. So I'm trying to make those arguments that, like, there has been Americanization, but there has also been anti-Americanization movement. Turkey was never non-aligned. They did not even participate in London conference. Enrico was not really part of Turkish paradigm. but there were many engineers, students, activists who were very much influenced by Nasser, for instance, in Egypt. They were very much influenced by Iraqi sort of like nationalism and how they overthrew the British presence there. So they were very much, and they pushed always. And there was sort of like different indigenization of communications, especially during the geopolitical crisis, when Turkey had geopolitical crisis with the US and NATO.
Taking advantage of my position here as moderator, I want to follow up on this question because I was reading and asking myself about vocabulary, because you use vocabularies that are common to us, like justice, like public sphere, and thinking of this, wondering if there were resistances and was there any effort, intellectual effort, of systematization that would adopt different vocabularies or different terms to describe what was being done out of this capitalist framework?
So let me say, a few things about justice. I think it's very important, and it's just totally overlooked in our West-centric discipline. So the typical idea is that like public communication has been rooted in the understanding of democracy, liberal democracy, and stuff. And even when Habermas talks about, for instance, public sphere, he goes back to coffee houses, journalism and stuff. But coffee houses were originated in Ottoman Empire.
You mentioned that.
They were part of, they were integral to public communication. I mean, well, it also depends on how you define public, but it was communal communication. So I'm just trying to write an article now looking at coffee houses in Palestine and region. So and they, the sort of like political. They were all very political from the 16th century onwards. Coffee houses were main places of political debate. They didn't have newspapers until 19th century. They didn't have radio or whatever, obviously. But they had different mechanisms of news. Rumor was a very important part of communication. So we, when we talked about today orality, so orality was part of it. So they, one of the prominent historians of coffee houses say, well, they didn't really need newspapers. If they needed newspaper, they would have had it. But even when they had newspapers, especially in Arabia, Ottoman Arabia, most of the commentators, op-eds, you would call them, they would say, listen, listen to me. So it's much more like written, but they were written for communal reading, communal consumption. And the idea was justice, not democracy, nothing like that. Yeah, democracy is, it was not, I mean, still I think is not a very prominent, desire for many societies. Justice was the key thing, and the understanding of justice has changed. Justice, just to briefly speak about it, there is this conception of circularity of justice from the 16th century onwards. You see it in Persian societies, in Ottoman societies. And now I'm looking at, archival material from Mesopotamia. Even 20th century, they talk about justice. So justice was the key thing. So the justice is like benevolence between the ruler and the ruled. So ruler is there because the ruled provide the whatever is necessary. So so the ruler needs to be justice in order to be a ruler. And it was totally anti-capitalistic notion. It's gone. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I follow up on that? what has remained?
I mean, I think like resistance changes, yeah. Like, I mean, well, we spoke about it. It's never pure and inspired. You know, I mean, I'm talking about Ottoman Empire justice and stuff, but we know what Ottoman Empire did to Armenians, what Turkey has been doing to Kurds. So I'm not, you know, I'm not romanticizing any of these things, but. So I think it has changed in different ways. I mean, I really like, for instance, third world women liberation. I think which we still have, like, in different forms. But you would find that these women were not necessarily like so inspirational in today's time, you know. But what remained, I guess, is the struggle. You know, what remained is the struggle. Incredible that there are so many journalists in Turkey. They're still doing their work despite everything. It's not only in Turkey, right? Mexico, Hungary, and many other places.
Increasing number of places, yeah.
Yeah.
So would you say that it's a struggle, it's a resistance, an ongoing form of reshaped resistance in the face of different struggles?
There's a continuity, I think. There's definitely a continuity in the form of struggles, yeah. Not only in the form, but also the understanding and doing things. Yes, there's definitely a struggle. I mean, there's definitely a continuum. It's very interesting to see, especially decolonial movements, in Kurdish movement, for instance, striking that, like, but in different, you know, in interesting ways, Kurdish movement has been militarized since 1980s. I can see some strategical, this is very controversial, but I see there's some strategical resemblances between Turkish liberation against European imperialism and Kurdish liberation movement against Turkish colonialism.
Okay, so can we have a round of questions? We have around 10 minutes. Can we collect?
Yeah, sure.
A couple? Do you need paper to write down? I have a.
Oh, okay.
Because if we collect a couple of them, maybe you
Yeah.
will need to write down.
Yeah.
So Gerhard,
And then
then Anthony, and then Sasha, and then we'll have four. Okay.
Thanks very much. I haven't read the book yet, but I remember a few months ago you told me you didn't like your book, and I wondered, you know, could you elaborate on that? Like, why should I read it? No, it's a serious question in the sense of, you know, what would you do differently? Like, what, you know, what's the things where you go, there's, you know, more I should have done, could have done.
I've done everything.
So you like it now?
No, So I would have written, for instance, now I feel this urge to write more about public and coffee houses, and so I would have written about these things more. But then, like, I mean, I wish Dan was here, but he was one of the editors of the series. Of the publishers, so they were very strict about the word count, so I couldn't go. So I have excuses, but yeah, I think I would have done it. I mean, I would have expanded on that more, which I will do hopefully.
Let's collect the three together and then respond to three of them.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to read the book. I'm curious, you piqued my interest in the idea of like newspapers being sort of secondary to like the oral cultures. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about how like seeing moments of self-reflexivity, or like, I think in Western culture, like objectivity is taught as like, of course, like it's naturalized into like what journalism was and what it turned into. But the way that you're talking about it, like journalism as being like a mobilizing tool, like journalism for justice as being the product of what people we're working together to create. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about that in the book. And of course, like, I would really like to read it, but I want to hear your comments.
Yeah, I find it very interesting, that Daniel Lerner used Turkey as the case to develop modernization theory, which became the dominant way of conceptualizing the role of mass media in inducing development and modernization. And he didn't choose it; was U.S. geopolitical interest that chose Turkey. But perhaps a comment on that. It's not really a question, but I think it's an interesting point for discussion.
So Doctor, when you mentioned coffee houses and women, that just triggered one question that I have always been curious about since I moved to the country in January. I live in a Turkish neighborhood in northern London named Harrogate, where there are a lot of coffee shops. So around 3, 4, 5 p.m., whenever I pass by these coffee shops, you see a whole coffee house of 30 Turkish men drinking and talking actively and passionately about something, but there's no single female customer. So my question is, why there are no women there? Second question is, what could this man be possibly talking about? What could this man be possibly talking about without women around? Okay. And third question is, does this reflect any social dynamics in Turkey and even in the Turkish neighborhood in London, where they probably have lived for quite some time? Where are the women? Yeah.
Can I just say this? You just pointed out several problems with the book, because the book does not answer any of those questions.
True.
To be continued.
Yeah, to be continued. 10 minutes to answer all this.
Okay, yeah, I will do it very short. So, Anjali, yeah, well, thank you very much. Journalism for Turkish-speaking community and Arabic-speaking community largely started from like 19th century onwards. But there was a printing press that was used by Jewish community of Ottoman Empire and some Christian communities as well. But and they did sort of like journalistic practices too, but it was very limited. It was very limited in terms of like production size and also impact. So seriously, these spaces like coffee houses, what we call marketplaces, and it's interesting now that I'm reading like British travelers in the region, they also talk about the bazaars as sort of like, oh, that's public space for them. That's public opinion. So these places were very significant. Also connecting to your question, and for women, yes, these places were not for women, but we should also flex a bit our understanding of gender, because people, men who were going to coffee houses were not necessarily heterosexual. So there was also homosexual, bisexual connections going on there. But women would come together in bathhouses, like hammams. So this was like, 19th century, but you can also find historicity of these things in earlier modern Ottoman society. So there was, journalism has really mobilized for justice, but journalism has also mobilized for violent nationalism. So we shouldn't romanticize it. Armenian genocide was also done through, or Greek displacement, all these things were also done through journalism too. So, Sasha, definitely, Daniel Lerner is incredible, and all the research that also Dan talked about, free flow of information, all these things were rooted in the Middle East. So Turkey was one of the sites, and they thought that Turkey is much more modern. That's why also they did this geopolitical connection with Turkey than Middle East, because they thought that like if Turkey is part of the NATO and all the sort of like Western consortium, political, economic, and military, that's very important. Then they could be place military bases or telecommunication infrastructures against Soviet, so because of the geographical proximity, and also a good gateway to oil resources in Iraq and in other places. So that's why Turkey was a sort of like test case for also Truman doctrine was based on two countries, one Turkey and the other one Greece, and that became the main framework for US imperialism in terms of telecommunications in Global South. So it's very interesting that then, yeah. So this modernization theory was also taken up by Turkish historians too. I don't know what they talk about coffee houses now, but they used to talk about, there were many things happening. Theaters, political debates, revolts, they were organizing revolts, and also daily idle talk. I mean, there are so many writings about coffee houses, it's interesting. But the Western audience do not know about these things generally in our discipline.
Yeah, sorry, the follow-up question is, does this reflect any social dynamics between men and women in Turkey?
At the moment? Well, I think like there is, I don't know, like coffee houses now is very working class thing. It's not like middle class or higher classes, but in the, from the 16th century to late 20th century, coffee houses were places for all classes of people, all ethnicities and linguistic groups. I think now, like many women are happy that their husbands are going to coffee houses. Like so I think they're happy.
Okay.
It's a macho country, yeah, just like many other places.
So, good point to end and continue the conversation while we keep drinking a bit. And where can we buy your book?
Amazon. I don't know.
Talking about capitalism,
Yeah.
Amazon seems like the right place.
So, yeah, well, Google it. Yeah, you'll find it.
Congrats, Burce.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so